My brother made my life a nightmare and got my wife pregnant. Now that our parents have disowned him and left me a $2 million inheritance, he is asking for my help. My younger brother David has always harbored a deep resentment towards me. If you think it was due to jealousy, you'd be wrong. He was the favored child, not me. So he had no reason to be envious. To give you some context, our mother always indulged David. He was the golden child of the family. She cooked for him, did his laundry, and even asked me to help him with his schoolwork. I was expected to assist him simply because we were family. Yet I never received the same support. I accepted this, as I was quite independent. Perhaps it was partly my fault. I always met his needs without expecting anything in return. He never helped me when I needed it, and only approached me when he wanted something. Unlike him, I was a quiet and introverted kid who enjoyed studying and keeping to myself. David, on the other hand, was loud and rough, just like our dad. I have always been honest and straightforward, never sugarcoating things. I believe my mother may have developed a negative perception of me because of my bluntness. She preferred to spoil David, and I didn't mind it when we were kids. However, problems began when he started bullying and mocking me for being different from him. He would tease me about my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He would sneak into my room, read my diary, and then complain to my mom about what I had written. When I yelled at him and demanded that he leave my things alone, my parents would just laugh, saying it wasn't a big deal. As time passed, his actions became worse. One time, he nearly broke my glasses and put disgusting things in my food. Once he even threw small stones into my cereal. But luckily, I noticed them before they could damage my teeth. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying that's how brothers show love. Whenever we fought, David would target my insecurities. We went to the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a few classmates. Instead of supporting me, he joined the bullies. He called me names like loser and ugly, encouraged others to hurt me, and told them I was a failure. One day, during an argument over something trivial that I can't even remember, he told me that I should just disappear. I could brush off most insults, but this one really hurt because at the time, I was struggling with my mental health. I'm doing better now, but hearing that from my own brother was devastating. My dad was often at work, and my mom didn't seem to care. Once she even scolded me, claiming that I provoked him. Over time, his behavior became increasingly dangerous. One shocking incident was when he attempted to set my hair on fire. Unbelievably, my mother defended him, saying he was just playing around. Thankfully, my father finally stepped in. He sided with me and made it clear that David's actions had crossed the line. He even threatened to call the police. For my brother, this was a wake-up call. He had never faced consequences before. My father told him that enough was enough, and that he needed to start respecting me. Later, my dad came into my room to talk. I never expected his support, because he always told David how similar they were, and it was true. But that evening he admitted that he had spent years hoping David would mature, only to realize that he was becoming a bully. Hearing this from my dad was incredibly validating, and I almost broke down in tears. I confessed everything David had done to me over the years, even the bullying at school. My dad was shocked at how much I had endured. The next day he went to my school and made sure the administration took action against my bullies. That evening, he enrolled me in an MMA class at a local gym. He told me I needed to learn how to stand up for myself. For a nerdy kid like me, the idea of fighting might have seemed laughable, but I took it seriously. I managed my time well, balancing my studies and daily workouts. MMA completely changed both my physique and my mindset. One day, David was back to his old tricks. He stole my pocket money, which I had been saving for a while. I caught him just as he was about to cycle off with his friends. I demanded he return my money, but he just smirked. I could do nothing but run to my dad for help. I don't know what came over me, but I punched David in the face. He was stunned, fell backward, and I retrieved my money from his pocket before pushing him back down. David started crying loudly, which was almost comical. However, my mother rushed out to help him and find out what had happened. When she learned that I had fought him, she was shocked and reprimanded me, saying I should be a better role model. David, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy seeing me scolded. My mother also complained to my dad about my behavior, insisting that I needed to be controlled. My dad, however, asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told him how David had stolen the money I had worked hard to save, while David tried to justify it by saying he needed the money for a date, and that as his brother, I should help him. My dad told David he was lucky I only punched him because anyone else would have called the authorities. He then firmly stated that David had no right to take other people's belongings without permission. David didn't like that, and threw a tantrum, likely hoping our mother would take his side. But Dad remained firm. When David realized he wasn't going to get me in trouble for defending myself, he screamed about how much he hated me and ran to his room, locking himself inside. After that incident, David started distancing himself from me. He had finally understood that he couldn't bully me anymore, and that even Dad had stopped supporting his behavior. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were equals. Though he could no longer physically intimidate me, he resorted to verbal insults whenever our parents weren't around. His behavior worsened with age, becoming angrier and more short-tempered each year. If I approached him with a question, he would ignore me and walk away, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. If he needed to communicate something, he would relay it through our mother instead of speaking to me directly. When I asked my mother why David couldn't just talk to me, she urged me to be more understanding. I couldn't tell if it was just teenage rebellion or genuine resentment. Over time, dealing with his comments became unbearable, and I longed to move out and get away from him. I repeatedly asked my mother to arrange a conversation for us to resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked for her opinion on why David treated me this way, she would brush off the question. Eventually, I left for my dream university after earning a scholarship as a top student. My dad threw a party for me, and even my mother seemed proud. However, David remained aloof and distant, barely acknowledging my achievements. The day I left for university was a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic home environment. The first few months at university were liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to build a life separate from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood. The constant fear of David's verbal attacks lifted, giving me a newfound sense of peace. During my second year, I met my wife Karen at a fraternity party through a friend, and we immediately connected. Coming from a religious background, having children outside of marriage was frowned upon. However, when we discovered she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to marry right after graduation. Our wedding was a small but joyful ceremony. Our parents were happy for us, and we enjoyed the celebration. At that moment, I believed Karen was the love of my life. I had always envisioned a committed relationship, one partner to come home to and share my life with. Despite other women showing interest over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, I later uncovered two incidents of betrayal in our marriage. One was an ongoing affair with her married coworker that spanned several years, and the other was a brief fling with an ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Some might think I was naive, and looking back, I can't completely disagree. Each time we separated for a while, I chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home, and believed we could overcome these obstacles. The affair with her coworker happened when we were young, and I attributed it to youthful mistakes and poor judgment. For a period, things seemed to get better. Although I could never fully trust her again, I did my best to set aside my doubts, knowing that if I chose to forgive, I had to genuinely work toward a fresh start. It had been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt confident in my decision to give her another chance. Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, planning our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was shattered once more, when she revealed that she had been having a long-term affair, and suggested that our son might not be mine. Her words struck me like a ton of bricks. A mix of shock, betrayal and disbelief overwhelmed me. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of her confession. In a daze, I managed to ask why she had kept such a significant secret, and how she could have done something so devastating. Her reaction was cold and indifferent, as if she were detached from the pain she had caused. Her vague responses left me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and painful moment, confronting the shattered trust and uncertainty about my own family. I continued to press Karen for the truth, because I felt I deserved to know the identity of the child I had been raising since birth. Ultimately, she admitted it was David. My eyes widened in shock as I asked Karen what she meant. She explained that she and David had become friends, when I introduced her to my family, and she stayed with us from Thanksgiving until New Year's. David, usually cold to me, was warm and polite toward her, which made me glad, because I didn't want Karen to feel unwelcome. Karen wanted to be accepted into my family, so she spent significant time with my mother whenever possible. She noticed the rift between David and me, and questioned me about it. I opened up about our strained relationship and explained that we might never repair it, due to his unresolved feelings. Karen understood, but started including David in our outings, hoping it would help us bond. Whenever we planned to watch a movie, she invited David, and we watched whatever he chose. During this time, David and I exchanged a few words, which was an improvement compared to his usual silent treatment. I remember Karen and David hanging out and playing video games together, but I never thought much of it. Karen told me that one day David opened up to her about his struggles in a recent breakup. Feeling vulnerable, he struck up a friendship with her. She mentioned that he would harmlessly flirt with her when I wasn't around, and eventually, things escalated beyond her control. The vision of my wife and brother betraying me made me feel sick. Karen confessed that she felt lost in the situation and never intended to hurt me. Karen felt guilty afterward and left him, which explained her sudden decision to go home instead of spending New Year's with me. Although I tried to convince her to stay, she was determined to leave. When we met again at college after the holidays, she was her usual cheerful self, so I didn't question anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was expecting a child. Karen admitted she didn't know if I was the father, or if it was David, and with no way to prove it at the time, she chose to stay with me, knowing I was the more reliable brother. That was the reason we got married. My world felt like it was crashing down. The son I loved might not even be mine. I asked Karen if she had been involved with David recently, and she slowly nodded. She revealed that they had always stayed in touch because their bond was too strong to ignore. They would meet in secret, lying to me about working overtime. She admitted that half of her business trips were actually spent with him. I asked why she married me, if she had feelings for my brother. Karen said she didn't want to be the one to end our relationship. She saw me as a great father to our son, and decided to stay. In her words, she had made a mistake, and didn't know when to stop. I told Karen I appreciated her honesty, but that I was going to pack up and leave. She started crying, asking for forgiveness, expecting me to be angry. Instead, I calmly gathered my things. Karen insisted that if I truly loved her, I should fight for her, saying that mistakes happen in every relationship. When she realized I wasn't going to change my mind, she shifted her approach, saying our son would be affected by a separation, and that children should not grow up in divided families. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, which made her cry even more, and accuse me of being cold. It seemed like she believed nothing would make me leave. Maybe it was partly my fault for ignoring things in the past. While I did care about her, my feelings were tied to the belief that we had a child together, and had been together since college. Karen kept insisting that it wasn't too late to fix things, but I couldn't bring myself to trust her again. Even if I forgave her, I would never forget what had happened. I have always believed in second chances, because we all make mistakes, but this was beyond what I could accept. I left her standing in tears at the door, and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and told them everything about Karen's relationship with David. I explained how they had been secretly meeting for years. The shock on their faces was clear. As expected, my mother initially tried to defend David, insisting that he would never do such a thing to his own brother. Determined to prove the truth, I asked my parents to remain silent while I called David in front of them. I instructed them not to say anything, so I could catch him off guard, making him believe it was a private conversation. When David answered, I confronted him. At first he strongly denied everything, refusing to take any responsibility. However, when I told him that Karen had already confessed, he started blaming her, calling her dishonest. He claimed it wasn't his fault if women were drawn to him, and even implied that he was the better-looking brother. I told him firmly that I would make sure everyone knew the truth. When David mockingly said that no one would believe me, because he was the golden child of the family, I simply thanked him for confirming everything. Knowing that our parents had heard every word, David suddenly fell silent, then began to stammer, trying to explain himself. My mother, still in shock, demanded an explanation from him. He struggled to justify his actions, blaming everyone except himself, and desperately trying to shift responsibility onto Karen. I could see that my mother, who had always protected him, now felt a mixture of disappointment and anger. For years, I had endured David's behavior. Now the truth was out, and the roles were reversed. David was the one exposed, with his actions clear for everyone to see. As David struggled to respond, my father, usually reserved in his emotions, couldn't hide his disappointment. He asked for the phone and spoke directly to David. "David," he began, his voice heavy with disapproval, "what you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, but of this entire family. You carried on this relationship even after their marriage. Your actions have serious consequences and have destroyed the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family, loyalty, and integrity. What you've done today goes against everything I've ever taught you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Your complete disregard for your brother's feelings and the lack of respect for his relationship are unacceptable. You haven't just hurt him, you've torn apart the bond that held our family together. Your mother and I are partially to blame for enabling you, but we will no longer stand by. Starting today, you are cut off from the college fund I set up for you. You will have to find your own way to pay for your education. I will also stop supporting your lifestyle. If you think you can act without consequences, let's see how you manage without my help." Throughout all of this, I remained calm. Although I initially felt an intense urge to confront David, watching my dad reprimand him was the ultimate form of vindication. I had exposed David's true character, and it was clear he had severely underestimated the consequences of his actions. Despite David's persistent protests, my mother continued to justify him. However, my father swiftly ended the conversation, shutting down David's attempts to explain himself. Afterward, my mom approached me and gave me a hug. It had been years since we shared such a moment, but in that embrace, there was an unspoken understanding and support amidst the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time. As a 14-year-old, I could never have imagined such a moment, being vindicated and embraced by my mother. After that, my dad helped me find a lawyer to file for divorce from Karen. She and her lawyer tried to fight back, asking for alimony, since I earned more than she did. But her affair worked heavily in my favor. We also had a paternity test done, which confirmed that David was indeed the father of the child. The news was painful, even worse than discovering Karen's infidelity. I was furious that the child I had loved and raised wasn't mine. However, I decided to stay strong. Karen begged me to continue visiting the child, arguing that the baby shouldn't be punished for the situation. But I couldn't bear to see him. He reminded me too much of David, and I couldn't stand it. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom as I moved into my own bachelor pad. It felt surreal to live alone after having been married so young, never really experiencing independence. But my naturally independent personality allowed me to quickly adapt, and I found myself thoroughly enjoying it. 2 weeks ago, my dad called me to say he was considering changing his will, because he didn't want to leave anything to David. My dad is incredibly stubborn, and once he made up his mind about cutting David out of his life, he stuck to it. David tried reaching out to our parents, and even showed up at their doorstep begging for forgiveness, but they refused to let him in. Even my mother, who usually gave in to David's tantrums, seemed done with him. Although it must have been difficult for her, I could see that she was fed up. David never texted me to apologize for what he had done, which showed that he didn't regret his actions. He was just upset about being cut off from our parents. Dad told me that he planned to leave everything to me to ensure that David wouldn't contest it later. He would leave David only $1. I was stunned. My dad had worked hard his whole life, and the total value of his assets, including his retirement fund and life insurance, amounted to nearly $2 million. The only condition in his will was that if my dad passed away before my mom, she would continue living in their house, even though ownership would transfer to me. I didn't mind this, as I wanted to care for my mom during her final years. Somehow, David found out about the will and, unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday, trying to make amends. He explained how he was struggling with college, and that after Karen found out the true paternity of the child, she had been pressuring him for child support. He said he had no money, and was looking for part-time jobs, but couldn't find anything. He begged me to talk to our family so we could start fresh, saying he really needed my help. I laughed in his face and told him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have thought about the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. David argued that I was being unfair, and that Karen was also to blame, to which I agreed. I reminded him that I had already divorced her, making her his responsibility now. He shouldn't be calling me to complain about her, or the child. Those were the consequences of his own actions. David raised his voice, but I interrupted him, reminding him that he was no longer the favored child in the family, but the black sheep who had betrayed his own brother. At that moment, David began to cry, telling me how everyone, including our grandparents and other relatives, had turned against him. While this was true, it was no longer my concern. I told him we were done, and that he should never call me again, as I no longer considered him my brother. Since then, I've replayed the conversation in my mind. Despite my animosity towards my brother, I had never heard him cry, at least not since we were kids. I won't lie, it did hurt me a bit to see him so helpless. So I guess I'm here to ask if I should talk to our parents about him, or if I'd be wrong for not updating them. Update 1. Hi everyone. Many of you have been asking why I am no longer in contact with my son Henry, and some have even called me cruel. I need to explain that I am not comfortable raising another man's child. This isn't a stepchild situation. I was led to believe Henry was my son, only to later discover he is actually my brother David's son. Naturally, this revelation hurt deeply, and I cried over it for days. The main reason I don't want any contact with Henry is that I no longer want Karen in my life. If I stay connected to her child, she will find a way to re-enter my life, and I need space. You may think I'm cruel or selfish, but I can't see him ever again, at least not for a long time. Update 2. Most of you correctly guessed that it was my mother who informed David about my dad changing his will, which led David to call me as a last resort to fix things. I confronted her in front of my dad, and she broke down, saying I had punished David enough, and that he had learned his lesson. My dad firmly told my mother that if she believed what David did was forgivable, he could no longer stay married to her because he could never forgive such a betrayal. This threat silenced my mother. My dad made it clear that if she ever talks to David again and we find out, she can pack her bags and leave. As I mentioned, my dad is very stubborn. Hopefully my mother will learn from her mistakes. Update 3. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved over the past few months. My dad and I go golfing every weekend, and he treats me more like a buddy than a son. Although my mother misses David, she has stayed away from him. The last I heard about David was from my cousin, who said that David had been asking everyone for money, and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the fees. He and Karen are living together, and he has a part-time job as a mechanic. Apparently, they are raising Henry together, which is a good thing I guess. I never discussed David with my parents, and they don't bring him up either. For everyone asking, I am doing quite well. I was promoted at my job 2 months ago, so my salary has significantly improved. I haven't been dating anyone, as I feel I still need time and space to heal. I've been going to therapy, and we'll see how that works out. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.